Hey there. Good to see you and have fun listening. When I married Chloe, I thought I knew her completely. She was bright, ambitious, and funny, the kind of woman who could light up a room just by walking into it. I loved her in a way that felt unshakable, like the foundation of a sturdy house. But lately, that foundation feels more like quicksand. It started a little over a year ago, though I didn't realize it at first. Chloe began retreating into herself in ways that were so subtle, they were easy to dismiss. She'd come home from work looking distracted. Her smiles would feel forced, and conversations we used to have late into the night were replaced with curt nods or vague comments like, "It was fine," or "just tired." At first, I told myself it was stress. Chloe had always worked hard. She managed marketing campaigns for a mid-sized tech company, a job that kept her on her feet and her phone buzzing at all hours. There was a major client on the horizon, one she'd been vying for since I'd known her. Maybe it's just the pressure, I thought. But pressure didn't explain the way she avoided my touch. It didn't explain the nights she'd spend sitting alone on the patio, staring at her phone like the answers to her life were somewhere in that screen. It wasn't just me who noticed. Our son, Max, who's 7, started asking questions. "Why doesn't Mom eat dinner with us anymore?" he asked me one night as we sat at the table. Chloe had claimed she wasn't hungry and had disappeared into the office. "She's busy," I replied, but even as the words left my mouth, I didn't believe them. Busy people don't pull away from their families. Busy people don't dodge simple questions or sit in the same room, but act like they're miles away. I began paying closer attention, trying to connect dots that I wasn't sure even existed. Chloe's phone, which used to be a shared space between us, was now always face down. She'd get notifications late at night, glance at them, and then swipe them away. One evening, when she said she needed to stay late at work, I offered to bring her dinner. It was a simple gesture, one I thought would be appreciated, but the way she reacted, her face pale and her voice hurried, made me feel like I'd crossed some unspoken boundary. "No, that's okay," she said, laughing nervously. "I'll just grab something with the team." The team, a convenient, faceless entity that could explain away anything. I didn't push her, not that night. But as the weeks went on, I started to feel like I was living with a stranger. The Chloe I knew, the woman I'd built a life with, was slipping away, and I didn't know how to hold on to her. There's a silence that fills a house when something's wrong, even when no one says it out loud. It's the sound of unspoken words, of glances avoided and doors quietly closing. Max felt it too. He started clinging to me more, asking if I could take him to soccer practice instead of Chloe, even though she'd always been the one to cheer the loudest from the sidelines. "I like it better when you're there," he told me one day, his voice small. I didn't ask why. I didn't want to know the answer. By the time fall rolled around, the distance between Chloe and me had grown into a chasm. I still tried. I'd plan date nights, surprise her with her favorite flowers, even take on more chores around the house to lighten her load. But nothing seemed to bring her back. One night, as we sat on the couch watching a show we'd both loved in the past, I reached out to take her hand. She flinched, just slightly but enough that I noticed. "You okay?" I asked, turning to face her. She forced a smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "Yeah, I'm fine. Fine." That word had become her shield, her way of deflecting anything real. But I wasn't fine. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening, something I couldn't see. Chloe was pulling away, but she wasn't telling me why. I started overanalyzing everything. The text she dismissed, the new clothes she'd bought but never worn at home, the dinner she skipped, and the late-night shower she took after long days at work. I wasn't the kind of guy who jumped to conclusions. But the whispers in the back of my mind were getting louder. What if there was someone else? The thought made me sick. It wasn't just about the possibility of her being unfaithful. It was the idea that she might be sharing parts of herself, her laughter, her kindness, her time, with someone who wasn't me. I tried to shake it off, but every time I saw her smile at her phone, that gnawing doubt crept back in. One Friday night, after putting Max to bed, I decided to ask Chloe directly. She was in the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of wine, when I walked in. "You've been distant lately," I said, my voice softer than I expected. She froze for a moment, her hand tightening on the wine glass. "I've just been tired," she replied, not meeting my gaze. "Is there something going on?" I pressed. She sighed, setting the glass down with a clink. "Why do you always have to make things so complicated, Ethan? Not everything is a big deal." Her words stung, but the way she said them, like I was the problem, hurt even more. I wanted to argue, to tell her how much this was tearing me apart, but I didn't. Instead, I nodded and walked away, leaving her in the kitchen. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling and wondering if I was losing my wife, or if I'd already lost her. I'd always thought trust was the cornerstone of our marriage. It was the quiet understanding that even if life got messy, Chloe and I would face it together. But as days turned into weeks, that trust started to feel like an old bridge sagging under the weight of too many unspoken words. The doubts came quietly at first, like whispers I could almost ignore. A late text she dismissed too quickly. An afternoon where she claimed to be at the gym, but came home with her hair perfectly styled. Small things that shouldn't have mattered, but in the quiet of my thoughts, they loomed large. One evening, as I sat in the living room flipping aimlessly through TV channels, Chloe walked in with her phone pressed to her ear. Her laughter, light and easy, drifted through the room as she moved toward the kitchen. "I'll let you know," she said, her voice soft but animated. "It's just been complicated lately." Complicated. The word stuck with me. When she hung up and set her phone on the counter, I tried to act casual. "Who was that?" I asked, keeping my tone even. She glanced at me, a hint of tension in her eyes. "Just Abby from work. We're coordinating this weekend's pitch." "Oh." I nodded, though the explanation felt rehearsed, like something she'd had ready just in case. Abby was her go-to name, the co-worker who conveniently seemed to need her at all hours. I'd never met Abby, but I felt like I knew her. She was always the reason for the late-night texts, the last-minute meetings, the whispered phone calls. I wanted to believe her, but doubt had already taken root. A week later, I found myself standing in front of Chloe's laptop while she was out grocery shopping. The screen was dark, her password protecting it like a vault door. I'd never thought to check it before, but now the temptation gnawed at me. This wasn't who I was. I wasn't the guy who spied on his wife. But as I stood there, the questions in my mind overwhelmed the guilt. The sound of the garage door opening snapped me out of it. I closed the laptop and stepped away, my heart pounding as Chloe walked in with a bag of groceries. She smiled at me briefly, but her eyes seemed to linger on the laptop before she turned away. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts circling like vultures. Was I imagining all of this? Was I turning minor inconveniences into something bigger because I didn't want to face the possibility that I was the problem? But if I wasn't imagining it, what then? The next day, I decided to test the waters. "You've been working a lot with Abby lately," I said over breakfast, trying to keep my tone light. "I feel like I should meet her at some point." Chloe glanced up from her plate, her expression carefully neutral. "She's just a co-worker, Ethan. No need to make it a thing." "I'm not making it a thing," I said with a small laugh, even though her answer didn't sit right with me. She shrugged and changed the subject, but I caught the way her shoulders tensed. It wasn't much, just a flicker of discomfort, but it was enough to fan the flames of doubt. The tipping point came one rainy Wednesday evening. Chloe was late again, claiming she was stuck in traffic on her way home. I believed her until I noticed her gym bag sitting by the front door, untouched. When she finally walked in, her hair was damp and her cheeks were flushed. "Sorry," she said, setting her bag down. "It was a long day." She leaned in to kiss me on the cheek, but I pulled back slightly, studying her face. Her expression flickered, just for a second, before she forced a smile. "Everything okay?" she asked, her tone just a little too casual. "Yeah," I said, though my voice betrayed me. She didn't press me, and I didn't press her. Instead, we moved through the evening like strangers playing a role, each of us pretending not to notice the growing distance. But later that night, as she slept beside me, I picked up her phone from the nightstand. My hands shook as I scrolled through her notifications, but there was nothing suspicious. No hidden apps, no unfamiliar names. I told myself this was a good thing, that I was overthinking it. But even as I set the phone down, the doubt lingered, whispering in the back of my mind. The next morning, I decided I couldn't keep living like this. I needed answers. "Chloe," I said as she packed Max's lunch for school, "do you ever feel like we're drifting apart?" She froze for a moment, her hand hovering over the peanut butter jar. Then she turned to me with a guarded smile. "What makes you say that?" "I don't know," I admitted. "It just feels like we don't talk the way we used to. Like you're keeping things from me." Her expression hardened. "Ethan, I don't know what you're imagining, but there's nothing going on. I'm just tired. Work has been crazy lately." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to take her words at face value and let go of the weight I'd been carrying. But something about the way she said it, the sharpness in her voice, the way she avoided my gaze, made it impossible. "Okay," I said finally, though the word felt hollow. She nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly as if the conversation was over. But for me, it was only beginning. That evening, as I sat in the quiet of the living room, I made a decision. If Chloe wouldn't give me the answers I needed, I'd have to find them myself. By the next morning, I was done sitting in silence, letting my doubts fester. Chloe left for work with her usual distracted smile, and I stood in the kitchen, staring at her laptop. It felt like a silent challenge, daring me to act. The password prompt blinked at me, and I hesitated, my hand hovering over the keyboard. I tried the obvious. Our wedding date, Max's birthday, her favorite book. Nothing worked. Each failed attempt only made my frustration grow. Shutting the laptop, I ran a hand through my hair. This wasn't who I was. I wasn't the kind of person who invaded someone's privacy, especially not Chloe's. But the gnawing feeling in my chest wouldn't let me stop. When she came home that evening, I studied her closely. She seemed lighter somehow, her laugh easy as she asked Max about his day. Her phone, as always, stayed face down on the counter. "You seem happy," I said casually, leaning against the doorway. She looked up and smiled, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Just a good day at work?" The team finally wrapped up a big project. Her answer was effortless, as though rehearsed. I nodded and let the subject drop, but the knot in my stomach tightened. That night, after she fell asleep, I lay awake, staring at her phone on the nightstand. My mind raced with possibilities, most innocent, a few unbearable. I reached for the phone, my hand trembling, but stopped myself. What was I even looking for? The next morning, while Chloe was in the shower, I decided to call Jake, an old friend from college who worked in IT. "Hey man," I said, trying to sound calm. "I need a favor. A big one." Jake's voice was cautious. "What kind of favor?" I hesitated. "I think Chloe's hiding something. I need to know if it's just in my head or if there's really something going on." There was a pause on the line. "Ethan, are you sure about this? Once you open this door, there's no going back." "I don't have a choice," I said quietly. "I can't live like this anymore." After some reluctance, Jake agreed to help. That evening, with his guidance, I set up monitoring software on Chloe's laptop. It felt invasive, like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. But I told myself it was better than spiraling in uncertainty. The first few days brought no revelations. Most of her activity was ordinary: emails, online shopping, Max's school forms. For a moment, I thought I might be imagining everything. But then I found something that made my breath catch. There was a message thread buried in her social media account, a conversation with someone named Daniel. At first, it looked innocent, discussions about hiking trails and favorite books. But as I scrolled further, the tone shifted. "Daniel, wish I could see you more often. Just texting doesn't feel like enough." "Chloe, I know. It's been complicated lately." "Daniel, complicated doesn't mean impossible." I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. Who was Daniel? How long had they been talking like this? And why hadn't Chloe mentioned him to me? I told myself not to jump to conclusions. People could have close friendships without crossing boundaries. But the way they spoke, the familiarity, the hints of longing, it didn't feel innocent. The days that followed were torture. I couldn't stop checking the messages, obsessing over every word. Chloe seemed more at ease, humming to herself as she folded laundry or cooked dinner. It was like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. It killed me to think that Daniel might be the reason for her happiness. Finally, one evening, She told me she had a late meeting with the team. My stomach churned, but I forced a smile. Don't work too hard, I said as she grabbed her bag. I won't, she replied, kissing Max on the head. As soon as her car left the driveway, I grabbed my keys and followed. She drove across town, eventually pulling into the parking lot of a small cafe I didn't recognize. I parked a few spots away, my heart pounding as I watched her through the rain-speckled windshield. Chloe stepped out of her car and walked inside. Minutes later, a man joined her at a table by the window. He was tall, with dark hair and an easy smile. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I didn't need to. Their body language told me everything. She leaned forward as he spoke, her laughter lighting up her face in a way I hadn't seen in years. He reached across the table, his hand brushing hers. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as I watched them. My mind raced with questions, but one thought stood out above all the rest. This was more than friendship. I sat there for what felt like hours, my chest heavy with the weight of betrayal. Chloe didn't glance at her phone or check the time. She was completely absorbed in the moment, as if nothing else in the world mattered. When they finally left the cafe, I stayed in the shadows, watching as they hugged before parting ways. Chloe climbed into her car, her smile lingering as she drove off. I didn't follow her home. I needed time to process what I'd just seen. Sitting alone in my car, I felt a wave of emotions: anger, sadness, confusion. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I'd shared my life with, was slipping through my fingers. And for the first time, I wondered if I'd ever really known her at all. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Chloe in that cafe, leaning in toward Daniel, laughing in a way that used to be reserved for me. By the time the sun rose, my chest felt heavy, as though the weight of what I'd seen was pressing the air out of me. Chloe had already left for work when I came downstairs. The kitchen was quiet, save for Max munching on his cereal. I forced myself to smile at him, ruffling his hair before sitting down with a cup of coffee. Is Mom picking you up today? I asked. He shook his head. You are. She said she's working late again. Of course she was. By the time evening came around, I felt like I was on autopilot. I picked Max up from soccer practice, made him dinner, and helped him with his homework. All the while, my mind churned, rehearsing the conversation I knew was coming. Chloe came home after 9, her heels clicking against the tile as she walked through the door. She smiled briefly at Max before setting her bag down on the counter. Hey, she said, her tone light. How was your day? Fine, I replied. My voice sounded calm, but my hands tightened around the edge of the table. Max, why don't you head to bed? It's late. He hesitated, glancing between us. Okay. Good night, Mom. Good night, sweetheart. Chloe kissed his head as he walked upstairs. The sound of his footsteps faded, leaving an almost oppressive silence between us. Chloe moved toward the fridge, pulling out a bottle of water. We need to talk, I said finally, my voice cutting through the stillness. She froze for a moment before turning to face me. About what? About you. About us. Her smile faltered, replaced by a wary expression. What's this about, Ethan? I stood, pacing the length of the kitchen. The words I'd rehearsed all day tangled in my throat. I feel like you've been distant, like you're hiding something from me. Chloe's eyes narrowed slightly. Hiding something? Ethan, where is this coming from? I know about Daniel. The words came out harsher than I intended, but I couldn't stop them. I know you've been meeting him. Her face paled, and for a brief moment, her composure cracked. She opened her mouth to respond, but then stopped, her jaw tightening. You've been spying on me? Don't turn this around on me, I snapped. I've been trying to hold this marriage together while you're off laughing with someone else. Do you have any idea how that feels? Chloe's eyes flared with anger. It's not what you think. Then what is it? I demanded, because from where I'm standing, it looks a hell of a lot like betrayal. She set the bottle down on the counter, her hands trembling. Daniel's a friend. That's it. Don't lie to me, Chloe. My voice rose despite my efforts to stay calm. You don't meet friends in secret. You don't lie about late-night meetings to grab coffee with them. Her expression shifted, the anger giving way to something else, defensiveness, maybe even guilt. I didn't tell you, because I knew how you'd react. Can you blame me? I asked, throwing my hands up. You've been shutting me out for months. What am I supposed to think when you start sneaking around with another man? Chloe crossed her arms, leaning against the counter. I needed someone to talk to. Someone who wouldn't judge me or expect things from me. Her words stung, cutting deeper than I expected. You couldn't talk to me? Your husband? The person who's supposed to be your partner? She looked down at the floor, her shoulders slumping. It's not that simple, Ethan. Then explain it to me, I said, my voice quieter now. Help me understand, because right now, I feel like I'm losing you. For a moment, she didn't respond. The room felt heavy, the silence stretching between us like a chasm. Finally, she sighed and looked up, her eyes filled with tears. I've been unhappy, she admitted. For a long time. The air seemed to leave the room. Unhappy. I repeated, the word foreign on my tongue. With what? With me? It's not just you, she said quickly. It's everything. The routines, the expectations, the pressure to be everything for everyone. I felt like I was suffocating. Her voice broke on the last word, and she covered her face with her hands. I wanted to comfort her, but I couldn't move. Her words were still sinking in, each one cutting deeper than the last. You should have told me, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Instead of turning to someone else. I didn't mean for it to happen, she said, her voice muffled. I just needed an escape. And now what? I asked. What happens to us? She lowered her hands, her tear-streaked face filled with uncertainty. I don't know. Her honesty hit me like a punch to the gut. For the first time, I realized that no matter how much I wanted to fix this, it might not be enough. I need time, she said softly, her voice barely audible. I nodded, though the gesture felt hollow. Take your time, but I won't wait forever. Chloe stared at me, her expression a mix of sadness and fear. I'm sorry, she whispered. Her apology hung in the air as I turned and walked out of the kitchen. The days following our confrontation were heavy with silence. Chloe and I fell into a fragile routine, like strangers bound together by duty rather than love. She stayed later at work, leaving me to pick up Max from school and handle dinner. When she was home, we barely spoke beyond what was necessary for our son. For Max's sake, I tried to act normal. I smiled when he told me about his day, laughed when he shared jokes, and helped him practice for his upcoming soccer game. But the truth weighed on me. Every time Chloe walked through the door, the tension in the air grew unbearable. I told myself I'd given her enough space, but the uncertainty was killing me. If she was still talking to Daniel, I needed to know. Late one night, when the house was dark and quiet, I sat at the dining table with her laptop in front of me. My heart pounded as I opened it. Entering the password Jake had helped me retrieve weeks earlier. The screen unlocked, and I was greeted by Chloe's desktop, a neat grid of folders and files. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the trackpad. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to find. Evidence of an affair? Messages confirming her unhappiness? I opened her email first, scrolling through unread messages. Most were work-related, but then I saw a name that sent a jolt through me. Daniel Rivers. The subject line was innocuous, thoughts on Saturday, but my hand shook as I clicked on it. Chloe, Saturday was wonderful. Thank you for being honest with me. I know this isn't easy for you, but I'll be here whenever you're ready. You deserve to feel happy. The message was short, but it felt like a gut punch. I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. What had they done on Saturday? What had she been honest about? I needed more. I went to her saved documents, searching for anything with Daniel's name. That's when I found a folder labeled personal. It wasn't password protected, and I opened it without thinking. Inside were photos. Most were mundane, pictures of Max, shots from a family vacation years ago. But as I scrolled, my stomach dropped. There they were, Chloe and Daniel, sitting in an outdoor cafe. In one picture, she was smiling at him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. In another, they were walking side by side, her face turned toward him, laughter in her eyes. I felt like I couldn't breathe. The next morning, Chloe came down the stairs, her hair pulled into a loose bun, looking exhausted. She poured herself a cup of coffee without a word, her back to me. "We need to talk," I said, my voice breaking the quiet. She froze, her hand tightening around the coffee mug. "What now?" I stood, pushing the chair back with a sharp scrape. "I know everything, Chloe. I know about Daniel." Her shoulders stiffened, but she didn't turn around. "What do you think you know?" "I saw the emails. The pictures. I know you've been meeting him behind my back." She turned slowly, her face pale but defiant. "You went through my laptop?" "Yes, I did," I admitted, my voice rising. "Because you wouldn't tell me the truth." Chloe set the mug down hard on the counter. "So, what now? Are you going to accuse me of having an affair? What would you call it?" I snapped. "You're sharing things with him that you won't even talk to me about. You're laughing with him, smiling at him, while I'm here trying to hold this family together." Her eyes flashed with anger. "You don't understand, Ethan. He listens to me. He doesn't make me feel like I'm failing all the time." The words hit me like a slap. "Failing," I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is that how you see me? As some obstacle in your life?" Her anger faltered, replaced by guilt. She crossed her arms, her gaze dropping to the floor. "It's not about you. It's about me. I felt lost, like I don't know who I am anymore." "Then why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice cracking. "I would have helped you. I would have done anything to fix this." Chloe shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't know how. And by the time I realized how far I'd drifted, it felt easier to talk to someone who wasn't involved." "Involved?" I laughed bitterly. "I'm your husband, Chloe. How much more involved can I be?" The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy between us. "I'm sorry," she whispered, wiping her eyes. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. But Daniel, he's just a friend. He's been helping me figure things out." "Helping you figure things out," I repeated, my voice sharp. "And what exactly have you figured out?" Chloe didn't answer. She stared at me, her lips trembling, as though she was searching for the right words. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I can't do this anymore, Chloe. I can't keep fighting for something when I'm the only one trying." Her face crumpled, and she reached for me, but I stepped back. "Ethan." "No," I said firmly. "You need to decide what you want, because I won't stay in a marriage where I'm second to someone else." She nodded, tears streaming down her face, but I didn't wait to hear her response. I grabbed my keys and walked out the door, the sound of it closing behind me echoing in my ears. As I drove aimlessly through town, I felt a mix of anger, sadness, and strange relief. The truth was out now. There was no going back. The next few days passed in a haze. Chloe and I barely spoke, navigating the house like ghosts, careful not to cross paths. Max, oblivious to the turmoil between us, filled the silence with stories about school and his excitement for the upcoming soccer match. I stayed late at work most nights, throwing myself into anything that would keep my mind off the storm brewing at home. But every time I returned, the tension hit me like a wall. Chloe was always in the living room or the kitchen, her expression blank, her eyes darting away when I entered. By the weekend, I couldn't take the limbo anymore. I needed answers. Real ones, not the half-truths she'd been feeding me. Saturday morning, I found her sitting at the dining table, staring out the window. A cup of coffee sat untouched in front of her. She didn't notice me at first, and for a moment I hesitated. Then I cleared my throat. "Chloe," I said, my voice firm but calm. "We need to talk." Her shoulders tensed, but she didn't turn around. "Max is upstairs," she said quietly. "I don't want him to hear." "I'll keep my voice down," I replied, pulling out a chair across from her. "But we can't keep ignoring this." She sighed, finally looking at me. Her eyes were red, as if she'd been crying. "What do you want me to say, Ethan?" "The truth," I said. "All of it. No more excuses. No more deflections. I deserve that much." Chloe looked down at her hands, twisting them nervously. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. Then she spoke. "I didn't plan for this to happen," she began, her voice trembling. "When I first started talking to Daniel, it was innocent. I was feeling lost, and he made me feel understood, like I wasn't failing at everything." I clenched my fists under the table, biting back the urge to interrupt. It wasn't supposed to be anything more, she continued. But then I started looking forward to our conversations. He wasn't just listening, he was helping me see things differently. See things differently? I repeated, my voice sharp. Like what? That our marriage doesn't matter? That sneaking around is okay, as long as it makes you feel better? Chloe flinched, tears spilling down her cheeks. It wasn't like that. I didn't mean to hurt you. I felt like I was drowning, and he threw me a lifeline. And what about me? I asked, my voice rising despite myself. I was right here, Chloe. I've been right here the whole time. Why didn't you turn to me? Her face crumpled. Because I didn't want you to see how broken I felt. I didn't want you to feel responsible for fixing me. The words hit me hard, knocking the wind out of my anger. I leaned back in my chair, staring at her. So what now? I asked. What do you want, Chloe? Because I can't keep living like this. She shook her head, her voice barely audible. I don't know. You don't know? I said, frustration creeping back in. After all this, you still don't know if you want this marriage to work? Her silence was deafening. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. I need to get out of here, I muttered, grabbing my keys from the counter. Ethan, wait, Chloe said, standing as well. I turned to face her, my anger and hurt boiling over. No, you need to figure out what you want, Chloe, because I can't keep fighting for both of us. She froze, her hands trembling at her sides. I'm sorry, she whispered, but the words felt hollow. I shook my head and walked out the door, the cool morning air hitting me like a slap. I spent the rest of the day driving aimlessly, trying to clear my head. The anger faded after a while, replaced by a deep sadness that felt heavier than anything I'd ever carried. I thought about Max, about the life we'd built, and wondered how it had all gone so wrong. By the time I returned home, the sun was setting. The house was quiet when I walked in, the soft hum of the dishwasher the only sound. Chloe was sitting on the couch, her face buried in her hands. She looked up as I entered, her eyes swollen and red. We need to talk, she said, her voice hoarse. I nodded, sitting down across from her. Go ahead. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. I want to make this work, Ethan. I know I've hurt you, and I know I've broken your trust, but I want to fix it. I don't know where to start. Her words hung in the air, fragile and uncertain. I wanted to believe her, but the wounds were still fresh, and my heart wasn't ready to forgive so easily. I need time, I said finally. If we're going to try, you need to cut all ties with Daniel. No more messages, no more meetings, nothing. And we need help, therapy, counseling, whatever it takes. But if you can't commit to that, then we're done. Chloe nodded, tears streaming down her face. I'll do whatever it takes, she whispered. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to feel hope. But as I sat there, staring at the woman I'd loved for so many years, all I felt was exhaustion. The following weeks were a blur of awkward conversations, quiet evenings, and tentative efforts to rebuild. True to her word, Chloe cut all ties with Daniel. I watched her delete his messages and block his number, her hands trembling as she did it. It should have felt like a victory, but it didn't. It felt like a truce in a war that had no winners. We agreed to start couples counseling. It wasn't easy to admit we needed help, but after everything we'd been through, it felt like the only path forward. Our first session was uncomfortable, to say the least. Sitting in that small, sterile office with a stranger asking questions about our marriage felt like ripping open a wound. How would you describe your relationship before things started to fall apart? The therapist, a calm woman named Dr. Reed, asked. Chloe hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap. It was good. We loved each other. We built a life together, and for a long time, it felt like enough. And now? Dr. Reed prompted. Chloe looked at me, her eyes filled with regret. Now, it feels like we're strangers. Her words stung, but I couldn't argue with them. What about you, Ethan? Dr. Reed asked. How do you feel? I sighed, leaning back in my chair. I feel like I've been running on empty for a long time. I was trying so hard to hold everything together, but I didn't realize how much I was losing myself in the process. Dr. Reed nodded. It sounds like both of you have been carrying a lot of unspoken expectations and resentments. Rebuilding trust will take time, but it starts with honesty. Honesty. The word felt heavier than it should have. Outside the therapist's office, Chloe and I sat in the car, the tension between us thick. "Thank you for agreeing to this," she said quietly. I nodded, staring out the window. "I'm not doing it just for you. I'm doing it for Max, and for myself." Her shoulders sagged, but she didn't argue. At home, things didn't magically get better. The distance between us remained, like a crack in a window that threatened to spread with the slightest pressure. We tried to talk more, to share the small, everyday moments we'd let slip away over the years. One night, as we sat on the couch after Max had gone to bed, Chloe reached for my hand. It was a tentative gesture, and for a moment I didn't move. Then I intertwined my fingers with hers, the familiarity of the touch stirring something deep inside me. "I miss us," she said softly. "So do I admitted. But I don't know if we can ever get back to what we were." "Maybe we're not supposed to," she said. "Maybe we're supposed to find something new." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. Counseling became a regular part of our lives. Each session brought up difficult truths, Chloe's feelings of inadequacy, my tendency to internalize stress instead of sharing it. Dr. Reed encouraged us to focus on the small victories, the moments where we felt connected, no matter how fleeting. It wasn't easy. There were days when I wanted to walk away, when the weight of what we'd been through felt unbearable. But every time I thought about giving up, I pictured Max's face and reminded myself why I was trying. One evening, as Max and I were kicking a soccer ball around the backyard, Chloe joined us. She stood on the sidelines at first, watching us with a hesitant smile. Then, to my surprise, she kicked off her shoes and joined in. Max laughed as we fumbled through a makeshift game, his joy infectious. For the first time in months, I saw Chloe's laughter reach her eyes. That night, as we tucked Max into bed, Chloe turned to me. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For what?" "For not giving up." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I really looked at her, and saw the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. She wasn't the same, and neither was I. But maybe that wasn't a bad thing. Months later, we found ourselves in a place that felt foreign yet familiar. The cracks in our relationship hadn't disappeared, but they were no longer threatening to shatter us. We'd learned to communicate better, to lean on each other instead of retreating into our own worlds. Chloe found a new therapist for herself, someone who helped her unpack the struggles she'd been hiding for so long. I started prioritizing my own well-being, carving out time for hobbies and friendships I'd neglected. There were still moments of doubt, times when the past threatened to overshadow the progress we'd made. But we faced those moments together with a newfound determination to rebuild. Not what we had before, but something stronger. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Chloe reached for my hand. "Do you think we'll make it?" she asked. I squeezed her hand, meeting her gaze. "I think we already are." Her smile was small but genuine, and for the first time in a long time, I believed it too.